Psalm 129. Psalm 129, fortunately, we're in a stretch of shorter psalms. And this psalm is 8 verses. I'm going to put it up in a moment. I entitle it from a phrase in the psalm, "Upon my back, plowers plowed." It's almost evenly divided as a psalm. The first half is in the first person, describing persecution. The second half is cursing on behalf of the community, the enemy. It is distinctive in its use of agricultural images for both the suffering and the cursing. And I'll circle back because we always try to make this relevant to talk about two thoughts or two themes. One theme that I'll want to talk about at the end is relying on God for miracles. I want to talk a little bit about Meron and the tragedy there recently. And also, most sadly, I want to also share the image of how one relates to one's enemies, which this evokes with the sadness of some of the images at the moment in Israel. With that, let me share Psalm 129, "Upon my back plowers plowed." As is our way, this is my own translation, which tends toward the literal, holding ambiguities. And I'll go back through it, sharing some of the commentaries, and then again circling back to how it's relevant for us. Psalm 129, a song of ascents. Greatly they have persecuted me from my youth. Let Israel now declare. Greatly they have persecuted me from my youth, yet they did not prevail against me. Upon my back plowers plowed, they lengthened their furrows. Adonai is just. God has cut the cords of the wicked. Let them be ashamed and turn back, all haters of Zion. Let them be as grass on rooftops, which before it springs up withers, so that no reaper fills his palm, nor a shoulder full for a sheaf binder, and no passers-by declaring, "A blessing of Adonai upon you. We bless you in the name of Adonai." And so a short psalm with some distinctive images. From the top, greatly they have persecuted me from my youth. And so here again, the me, all the more when it says, let Israel now declare. Well, it can be, the me can be stated on behalf of Israel, or it can be as an individual that is an integrated part of Israel. This image of affliction from one's youth is one that occurs in other places in the Bible. So Ibn Yahya, who's a 16th century Portuguese Jewish commentator, will say this is going back even to Egypt, where in the prophet Hosea, for instance, Ki na'ar Yisrael, from the youth Israel, Vahavuha, I have loved her. Umitzrayim karati livni, and in Egypt I called to my child. It's not clear if this psalm is written in response to a specific event. Some classic commentators will place it at different points of life in Israel or in diaspora. But Israel, of course, is situated at a crossroads, and existing at a crossroads is a place that have had many run-ins with attack. It's maybe a generic kind of expression rather than a response to a specific moment unclear, as is the nature of Psalms. Greatly they have persecuted me from my youth, yet they did not prevail against me. Upon my back plowers plowed, they lengthened their furrows. Now this image here of upon the back, that has a resonance, a similar resonance in the prophet Isaiah, where Isaiah chapter 51, God says, I will put in the hands of your tormentors who have commanded you. So this is God saying, I'm going to turn it around for you. Those who said to you, Shechi v'na'avora, get down that we may walk over you. V'tasimi cha'aretz gevech, so that you made your back like the ground. V'chachutz la'ovrim, like a street for passers-by. Here, the translations of verse 3, here's one from Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, making long welts on me. So that the image is, they have whipped me, my enemies. Or Adin Steinsaltz, as if slashed at my flesh. It can also be just a metaphor of suffering. Malbim, 19th century Ukraine, will emphasize that to have a lengthened furrow is to be unobstructed, that the enemies had nothing, to hold them back. So an image of agriculture in a time in which agriculture was how most people spent their day in work. But here, an image of agriculture that is of suffering. And that's the other way, this lengthened their furrows. It felt unending how they were plowing as if on our own backs. And yet, verse 4, Adonai is just, Adonai tzaddik, kitzei tzavot reshaim, God has cut the cords of the wicked. Now that could be, here now a shift, it can be a continuation of the same image. So some commentators will say, like Rosenberg and Zlotowitz, that in order for this plowing to take place, there were heavy ropes between the plow and the animal. And when you cut the cord, then it stopped the plowing. So that's one possibility of what the image implies, that God, cut the cord between the ox and the plowers, so it stopped. Or it can be that the cords being referred to are the cords of the wicked with which they wrapped us. In either case, here it's Adonai who in God's righteousness, this word tzaddik or just, enabled that suffering to end. That's the first half, 1-4. We have suffered using these images of the plower plowing on our backs. And now the curse. Those are the next 4 verses. Let them be ashamed and turn back, all haters of Zion. And here it's clearly national, the focus, rather than just the individual, Sonei Tzion. The word for turn back, Yisogu, that's how Ibn Yahya, who I just mentioned, of Portugal of 16th century, understands the word based on the Hebrew nisog. Rashi will see the root differently, as sagim, meaning dross. Let them be as dross. Which is to say, back to the Hebrew, there's always this poetic use of obscure words in which the roots can have more than one possible meaning. And that's more so in 6. There's a distinctive phrase, the second half, Shekadmat Shalaf Yavesh. So first the beginning of verse 6. Here again, the curse continues. Let them be as grass on rooftops, which before it springs up withers. So a little context for, again, a realia of another time. As Adine Steinsaltz points out, in this biblical period, people's houses had flat roofs, and the roof was a mix of mud and clay. And sometimes there'd be thatch on top of the mud and clay, and there'd be seeds mixed in, which could take root and sprout, not uncommon, or maybe other seeds that got blown onto the roof. But the soil was so thin and the sun was so hot on the roof that there was not enough moisture, and whatever would sprout out would quickly dry up. So it's really, this powerful image that was probably a familiar image of people's roofs. And it conveys a quality of desperation. Let them be as grass on rooftops, which before it springs up withers. A quality either of desperation, of looking to harvest wherever they could, even fruitlessly from their own roofs, or the image of that's the best they could do, meaning they would have no crops. So that, as a result, no reaper fills even his palm, nor a shoulderful for a sheaf binder. They have nothing to harvest. That's the image. Nothing to be harvested. And here too, just to share how the words are often unusual words. Chitzno, here I translate as shoulder full. Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, lived in Narbonne, France, 1160 to 1235. He translates it as shoulder based on a verse in Isaiah 49:22. But Rashi has it as chatzan, meaning a garment, nor a garment for a sheaf binder to fill. And now the closing line. Velo amru ha'ovrim, and no passers-by declaring, a blessing of Adonai upon you. We bless you in the name of Adonai. And here, Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, points to Ruth 2:4. And Ruth is on our minds as we're only within a week of Shavuot when we read the book of Ruth. There, Boaz, the man who would marry Ruth, is a farmer. And here in 2:4, he comes to Bethlehem, and he says, V'yomer lekotzrim, and Boaz says to the people harvesting, Adonai imachem, may God be with you. V'yomer lo, and they respond to him, Yevarechecha Adonai, may God bless you. And so Rabbi David Kimchi points to this exchange in the book of Ruth to say that is either something that was not uncommon in the biblical world, this exchange of blessings. And here, the curse is evoking the blessing, evoking harvest, but in the negative. In that sense, again, it's the unagricultural, unharvest harvest. And so nobody's going to say this because they will have nothing to harvest, and nobody would want to talk to them. Even with the familiar words of greeting, they will be pariah-like, unworthy of engagement. And so this psalm uses images distinctive to the psalm. The image of it, the rooftop plants that withers before they spring up. That is a unique phrase, shekadmat shalaf yavesh. And at the same time, other images that at least have a suggestion elsewhere in an agricultural world, the sense of being forced to lay down, and your own body being the soil that was plowed by those who had superior power and sought both to taunt and to torture. And so this short psalm, divided between a description of torment and curse, has a quality of negativity that points toward the positive. The positive is it evokes a few things. It evokes, one, God's protective presence, because they who tormented, who persecuted, failed. And they didn't fully fail because the second half is a curse on them. Here's something important to know. If in verses 1 to 4 they tormented physically, plowing on the back, the curse does not call for them to be physically injured. Rather, the curse is that they should be unsuccessful in their own plowing, in their own harvesting. That's something Rabbi Benjamin Siegel points out, that part A and part B are not, if you will, consistent in that way. Here it just says, God let them fail so that they are shunned, ultimately. And in the last verse, which is a verse that closes with blessing, withhold, points to the possibility of blessing. The first part, again, is one of gratitude that they failed because God is just. And it points to God as the reason that they did not prevail, as if that was a miracle. Which leads to that, how is this relevant? Part A, and that's Maron. And that's to say, I was deeply saddened by the people who were crushed to death in Maron. 45, I think, was the last count, stampeded at a religious gathering on Lag BaOmer. I was in Maron 3 years ago for that same gathering where there were hundreds of thousands. And in this case, there's two things that are shocking. So it was about 100,000 that were permitted to dance together. Know that in the ultra-Orthodox community, there are many who are not vaccinating, sadly, who are not attuned to science, sadly. And the fact that they would be all crowded together is also shameful on behalf of the government and organizers for allowing that kind of gathering amidst COVID, because that's a super spreader. Let alone the kind of planning that was preventable and was known as a danger. I mean, what happened is people were in these bleachers, and as people on the top tripped, probably over water or wine that had spilled, it was like a domino of people coming down on top of people beneath and gaining momentum. I saw those bleachers 3 years ago. They're very high. Think of a football field, literally. That's the size of this open space for dancing, but people are in these high bleachers. And then as people tried, because there was this avalanche, to leave, there was a bottleneck, and people got stampeded again. And a lot of people go into those situations saying, we're going to be worshiping God. We're going to be praying. We're going to be singing and rejoicing. And God will protect us. And in our tradition, the Talmud will say, Al tismoch b'nes, do not rely on a miracle. That's a statement in the Talmud. You have to use your best efforts, your reason to protect yourself, and you have a duty to pursue safety, which means medical care, vaccines, which means managing a crowd. And I'm deeply saddened by this tragedy. It's Israel's most great loss in terms of numbers in recent years, all self-inflicted. And so as I read a psalm like Psalm 129, I am reminded of the need to express gratitude from hindsight when things turn out well, but the caution not to rely on miracles for things to turn out well, that you have to use best efforts to take care of each other. And there's a danger in a mindset of celebrating God as the one who prevailed on my behalf, and that is a reliance on miracles. And to do so, I think, is to distort the nature of prayer. You think, but you don't necessarily rely for goodness that is supernatural. And that leads to the second half. I am deeply, deeply pained to see those images in the videos this morning in the news of fire from the Al-Aqsa Mosque area. Fire because there was a tree that went ablaze due to the firing of canisters. I'm not sure how it went on fire, but there was this fire on the Temple Mount amidst the rioting taking place. And there were young zealots celebrating beneath Yom Yerushalayim. That's the day in which Jerusalem became whole. That's a day of celebration. But the contrast of them singing songs of triumph with rioting and the Temple Mount ablaze juxtaposed, for me, is deeply painful, even shameful. And so here I seek to find the best in our religious tradition. And by doing so, we clearly cherry pick on some degree, because Psalms and the sacred text has images that are disturbing. I knew a psychiatrist in La Jolla. He was originally from Germany. And he read the Bible as simply, violently, and God triumphantly, as a way for him to reject the Bible. There are those images of war in the Bible. But I find here verses 5-8 also a source of hope making, that those who tormented us, we pray for them to be punished, but not to be tortured in response. There's still a sense of verses 1-4 do not lead to the decimation of the enemy. They're still there, which is why we're cursing them. And they're still the enemy. But may they not be successful, is verses 5-8. May they not be blessed. May they be pariahs. For me, that feels more like a godly response. And I pause because I do know, I was teaching a high school class yesterday, 50 high school students were Zooming with me. And of the 50, there was one Jewish student. And I did get questions from a Muslim student, which also delighted me. And the Muslim student wanted to know my response to the rioting in Jerusalem. And rightly so. And I was able to say to her, it's complicated. We have to be careful not to freeze frame things, to know how it is, how the details matter, how there's a video and not a freeze frame. And yet I'm sad, deeply sad, and I have a prayer that things will change. But it's not simple. Any more simple, I said, than when a couple divorces and don't want to be together because there's too much pain in remembering how it broke. So in Israel, there's a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, and it's complicated. But to say it's complicated does not mean that there's no reason to find and distill an essence of hope for things to be better. And so this psalm, without reading too much in at the same time, is a psalm in which is evenly divided with gratitude to God for having released and relieved suffering against those who it feels like have been seeking our suffering from our youth when we were even unable to defend ourselves. May they be ashamed and turn back, those all haters of Zion. May they not be blessed by others until they turn back. Because here there's a word play. Let them be ashamed and turn back. It's not clear if turn back can also mean turn back from what they are doing, meaning repent and seek another way. I am not embarrassed that Psalms are written from a particular point of view. They are the words of Zion. They are the words of the poet of Israel. They are words that still resonate, if you will, as a voice of particularity. And that is understandably so. And yet, as they are words to God, who represents the perspective of above, of the universal, may they also create sparks of hope in how we read and relate to them. So with that, as my riff, I now welcome any thoughts and reactions to Psalm 129. And I'm going to have Julia, who just raised her hand, and Shula, and then Amy gets the last word, and you can speak a little longer, Amy, about your reactions. But I have Julia, then Ken or Shula, and then Amy. Go ahead, Julia.
Well, it's just so fascinating, that ending, that is like a citation from the book of Ruth, but it's a citation of a moment of dialogue with one person blessing and the other person responding by blessing.
Yeah.
And the book of Ruth itself is about intercultural peace, insofar as, Ruth follows Naomi and chooses to remain part of Naomi's faith. So it seems to me that there's like a hidden alternative story or hidden alternative path that has to do with exchange of blessings versus animosity. And the fact that it ends, by both denying the blessing, but also kind of offering it, but as, dialogue. And so many of the Psalms, are implicitly dialogues with kind of, whether it's an internal dialogue or an actual choral dialogue. So I just found the whole connection to the book of Ruth to be very fascinating. And some hope there for the hope reading that you're trying to find in it.
So let me pull that back up just to share Julia's insight. So the closing verse here, V'lo amru ha'ovrim, and no passers-by declaring, Birkat Adonai alechem, a blessing of Adonai upon you. Berachnu etchem b'shem Adonai, we bless you in the name of Adonai. So first is, as Julia evokes, it sounds like this is a statement of both hope making, meaning what's being withheld is the dialogue. And that's the hope, the yearning, because that is how it's presented in the book of Ruth. And again, it's Rabbi David Kimchi of Narbonne, 1160 to 1235, who explicitly makes that link. And so the poet here evokes an image of the past that's familiar to the biblical reader as part of the curse-yearning, the yearning for dialogue with the other, that exchange of blessing. And yet there's at the same time ambiguity, because here it's not clear if it is meant to be an exchange or a one-liner. So that's the tension. And that's, again, the nature of poetry, is to create a tension with ambiguity. So it's not clear if this is meant to be the exchange, which it is in the book of Ruth, or a one-liner that they are to be ignored. And yet to pull it back together, I love your insight, Julia, on how the last line is a kind of a yearning for exchange, because there is clearly the echo here of Boaz in the field in exchange with the harvesters amidst his life. Cantor Shula, and then last word for Amy. You got to unmute.
I was particularly impressed by the words of verse 3, because looking at the word lema'anitam, that can also come from the Hebrew word le'anot, which means to torture, actually torture. They, upon my back, they plowed and they lengthened that torture. And what impressed me is that really plowing is something good. It is something life-giving. It is something that brings growth and continuation, but they turned it into major torture, as the word lema'anitam can mean. And fortunately, in verse 4, the verb that is used as to what God, the just God, did is kitzetz. Of all the words that could be used, kitzetz means cut. It's definitive. So theirs was such a cruel action using a positive to create a torturous negative, but the just God was able to see it and cut.
Such, again, sensitive reading. So let me pull it up again so everybody can appreciate Cantor Shula's insight. Verse 3, upon my back plowers plowed, he'erichu, and you get in the scribal notes what's called the written form and which is Ketiv and Kri, the way they recommend reading it, which is changing one letter. The Vav gets shortened to a Yud. And you can see how that could be a scribal error, a Vav being made into a Yud. So they recommend Lema'anichtam, which can be for your afflictions, from, or most commonly and in context, they lengthen their furrows. But as Shula emphasizes, normally we think of creating furrows as a positive, of a planting, of a working in partnership to the ground. And here the tension is the positive becomes a negative, an image of torture, because it's on our backs they're plowing. So that's itself a poetic tension that has a richness. And then the verb in verse 4, which describes verse 4, God is just, God is righteous, as kitzetz, as cutting. And here too, the contrast between lengthening furrows, which means kind of it's continuous, and here the response is something like snap, ending it, is the contrast between God's power and the evil that they're perpetuating. So in that regard, there's a sense of the poetry of the specific words that are chosen here to convey both a positive that becomes a negative and to emphasize God's ready and definitive response with the word kitzetz. With that, our honoree. I said a few words about my friend, Amy Letterman, in the introduction, but now that I have everyone, I want to say that I learned, Amy, to have a person that the study is dedicated to. It makes, for me as a teacher, the study more meaningful. And also, in this case, is my chance to harvest friends who I don't get to see too often. And you came to mind, Amy, because of the birthday of your husband, Ray, who was so, so dear to me. Ray was a child psychiatrist in Tucson that I met with Amy in Israel on that sabbatical. And once we returned to America, Ray would call me every Friday for the next 18 years to wish me a Shabbat Shalom. And that was simply because Ray was that kind of friend to his friends. And when he passed too early, too soon after his retirement, Amy had to arrange to use the Jewish Community Center for his funeral because there were so many hundreds of people who wanted to be part of that funeral. And I had the privilege to be there. But Amy, in your own right, you are so beloved and dear to me, and a adult learner who, after a serious illness as a lawyer, decided to find more meaning in your life and became a Jewish educator. And in fact, it was as you had a fellowship with the Melton Institute at Hebrew University that Ray left his practice, not knowing what he would do on the other end, to have a sabbatical as a family in order to be there for you. Because again, that's who Ray was, always there for others. And you went on in Tucson to really create Melton in a big way, and later the Community Foundation, and have been such a educator and shaper of Jewish life in that next phase of your life. And so, Amy, it's a treat for me to honor you and to see you.
Thank you.
Any reactions to our study this morning?
Yeah, actually, first of all, you know what? I thought Mother's Day was great. This is like, Shmini Atzeret. I get to keep on going with the joy. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah.
I had a very strong reaction. Everybody, and especially you, shaped this feeling of tension. So I realized the writer really invoked and evoked a level of tension that each one of us sort of interpreted differently, as did our sages. The tension I felt with this was between the actual text and being the reader of the text. And I thought about it a lot in terms of reader response to the text. So in the text makes you feel that if you are the enemy, you are severed, you're isolated, you're blocked from God. God has cut the cords of the wicked. I mean, you're totally amputated from access to God. And it seemed interesting to me that the two bookends were sentence number 4 in the first section and sentence number 4 in the second, each one isolating the participants in this kind of horrific effort to abuse and hurt the Jewish people. Their punishment really was a total severing or amputation from God and from God's blessing. But I loved that I, as the reader, and I'm thinking the Jewish people as the recipients of this poetry, felt similarly. I felt by reading it more connected to God because I was on Team God. I was tethered to God because I wasn't that person. So I loved this because it let you actually have both sides presented, one by the experience of being the reader and the other by seeing what the actual text was and the evolution of that. So that was my reaction. So at the end, I thought how beautiful to be someone who can craft a poem like that without being direct to the recipient who reads it or the reader, but to help that reader actually feel more proximity to God as a result of the text.
I again love your own poetry of words. Words like tethered and amputated are very evocative for me. And I love what it leads you as the reader to share, which is that it evokes the yearning to be attached to God as the source of blessing.
Right.
And in a context of tension, both tension of the past and tension of life in any moment. And I, again, am moved by what is evoked for you and grateful to share it with you.
Thank you. Thank you for this honor.
You're welcome. So tomorrow, and I think it's more than coincidental, Psalm 130 is about forgiveness. It's a psalm very different, and I see it as connected to Psalm 129. Psalm 130, which I chose to title from a phrase in it, "For with you is forgiveness." There is a sense that one is only able, it's a very personal psalm, that one is only able to move forward in life because God is willing to overlook our wrongs. And here too, we'll decide tomorrow if that theme can be linked with this psalm, where again, the enemy is detached from God, but is still given possibilities of change.
Mhm.
Psalm 130 tomorrow. Amy, thank you for allowing us to honor you.